The suffering servant is a term used by this author, second Isaiah. The suffering servant's found, technically that term is found only in second Isaiah. There are 4 passages that are called the songs of the suffering servant. That's what scholars call them. And there are 4 passages that chapter 42, in chapter 49, chapter 50, and then the last part of chapter 52 into chapter 53. So we're going to be talking about that one, especially chapters 52 and 53. But it's the 4th of a number of passages that are referring to somebody called the servant of the Lord. And in these passages, it's clear that the servant has suffered and God is now going to restore him, going to bring salvation to this servant. And so these 4 passages all cohere together, and they all cohere within the message of 2nd Isaiah itself, chapters 40 through 55. That's very important to understand when we're going to be talking about Isaiah 53. This is not an isolated section that's separated from everything else. You have to read this entire part, the entire thing of 2nd Isaiah, to understand really what's going on in Isaiah 53. I just assumed from the time I read Isaiah 53 when I was a teenager, up through college, really until I went to seminary, I just assumed it was a messianic prophecy about Jesus, because that's the assumption, and that's just what everybody assumes, and that's what everybody says who's in the church, and so you just assume that's right. It wasn't until I was a graduate student, probably in my second year of my master's program at Princeton Theological Seminary, where I went, where the professors were, they were believing Christians. Most of them were ordained ministers or active in the churches, but they were also good critical scholars. And it became clear, studying Isaiah carefully, critically, and just reading the whole thing, which people don't do, but they should. When you read it and put it in context, it's pretty clear it's not talking about a future Messiah. And so that's, I think I recognized it maybe my second or third year, and it was a real revelation to me, because it took a long time to get my mind around it, that it could be about something else. But when you read it in its context, it's about something else, as we'll see.
So does 2nd Isaiah make any prophecies about the Messiah or otherwise?
Yeah, so let me say something more broadly about this. We've talked a little bit before on the podcast about these prophets in the Hebrew Bible, which include Isaiah and Jeremiah, Ezekiel, but they also include the so-called minor prophets. There are 12 of those: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, and so forth. And these prophets do predict what's going to happen in the future, but in every case, they're talking about stuff that's going to happen very soon in their lifetimes. In almost every instance, what's going on is that the prophets are warning the people that they've done things wrong and there's going to be a punishment, and they need to turn back to God, or it's going to be very nasty for them. And in many of them, they also then go on to predict that once they've been punished, it'll be okay. And so you get prophets like Isaiah and Amos that are talking about very specific situations that are happening in their own day. First Isaiah, it's quite clear. Isaiah will tell you which king is ruling at the time, which king of Judah is ruling, for example, or what king of Israel, and he'll say what is about to happen, and the Assyrians are going to come in, they're going to wipe you out, and he's talking about something that hasn't happened yet, but he's not talking about things that are going to happen centuries later. He's delivering a message to his people that they need to shape up, and so there are prophecies like that. And there are prophecies sometimes about predictions about individual people as well.
Does he ever make predictions about a coming Messiah or some kind of heroic figure that we could use to kind of compare with the suffering servant?
Yeah, so this is the really interesting thing that I had no idea about. I'm going to say I just had no idea about. He actually does talk about a Messiah. He talks about a Messiah who will help bring salvation to the people of God. And he tells you his name. It's Cyrus, the king of Persia. He literally calls him the Mashiach, the Messiah. Mashiach in Hebrew means the anointed one. It is used of the kings of Israel because during their coronation ceremonies, they were anointed with oil. And so they're the specially favored ones of God through whom God works his will. But when 2nd Isaiah is writing, there's no king of Israel anymore, or of Judah, because Israel's the northern part of Israel. Israel itself was destroyed by the Assyrians, no more king. The Judeans in the south the people of Judah were destroyed. The nation of Judah was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and they took the king off the throne. There's no king, no Jewish king, no Israelite king anymore. So Isaiah predicts that there is going to be somebody that God uses to bring salvation to his people. And what's going to happen is that the Persian king, Cyrus, who's a complete pagan, okay, he's not a follower of the God of Israel, but God's going to use him to destroy the Babylonians and to set free the exiles so that they can return. And so he talks about this in a couple of places, chapter 42, etc., where he actually names Cyrus and calls him the Messiah. He does not predict a future Jewish Messiah, though. I don't know any student I've ever had who can read Isaiah 53 and not think Jesus. I mean, it just, what it says is, it has these verses about, he suffered for our iniquities, he's bruised for our transgressions, the punishment for our peace was upon him. By his wounds we have been healed. You can't read this and not think about the crucifixion, because we've been raised by, we've been told this is about Jesus. And so you can't read it. And of course, when the gospel writers wrote their accounts of Jesus dying, they knew Isaiah 53. and they knew other passages in the Old Testament that they thought were predictions of Jesus. And so obviously they told their stories about Jesus in light of these other passages, such as Isaiah 53. And so it makes it really hard to read these passages, read Isaiah 53 without thinking of Jesus' crucifixion. We have Jewish writings, of course, from the Old Testament, but then also after the Old Testament, going up, up till today, basically. Before Christianity, we don't have any Jewish writings that talk about Isaiah 53 being a reference to a future suffering Messiah. And so far as we can tell, there was not a tradition at all within Judaism of a future suffering Messiah prior to Christianity. There are later Jewish texts that refer to a Messiah that might have to suffer. These are after Christianity, possibly influenced by Christianity, but nobody was interpreting Isaiah 53 or any part of Isaiah or any part of the Hebrew Bible to refer to a future suffering Messiah. The suffering Messiah was a nonsensical term, because the Messiah was supposed to be the figure who was a powerful representative of God that God would use to slay the enemies. The idea that he's going to be, tortured or killed by the enemies was just the opposite. And so of what anybody would have expected. And so, no, the answer is no. We don't have any clear expectation of this anywhere in any of our Jewish writings.
So if we look in a little bit more detail at the actual language of Isaiah 53, I think the verse that people are most likely to recognize is the one that I read right at the top of the interview. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. That's Isaiah 53:5. And like I said, it reads Jesus to me and many other people who were raised as Christians. Obviously not what the author was anticipating. I am not who the author was writing for. When this was written, who was the author intending the audience to think about?
Okay, so it's kind of it's kind of a detailed issue, but when you're trying to figure out who this servant was, you want to do several things. First, you want to see how the servant is talked about in the four passages. You want to see those four passages in the broader context of 2nd Isaiah. It's quite clear, starting with chapter 40, that the people have suffered, those who have been in exile have suffered for the sins of the people, and that now God is going to restore them to the land. He's going to bring them salvation. He talks about it as a second Exodus. Just as the people were brought from slavery in Egypt under Moses, now they will return from Babylon, also in triumph, and God will once more bring salvation to them. So they sinned, they've been punished, they're now going to be saved. So that's the broader context. The suffering servant is talked about as the one who has suffered, and who is going to be vindicated. An important point to make about that is that when Isaiah talks about the suffering of the servant, he talks about it as something that has already happened. He does not talk about it as a prediction of what's going to happen to someone later. He says that he has been wounded for our transgressions. He did suffer those stripes. He was punished. It's in the past. It's the past. It's happened already. But he will be vindicated. God will bring salvation. So it doesn't even read like a prophecy. It reads about a statement of something that's happened already. In this context of the people of Israel suffering. So you think about all those things, and then you look closely. Does the author ever tell you who this servant is? Does he ever name him? And to my surprise, when I first realized this, the answer is absolutely yes. He tells you in a couple of places, specifically who it is in chapter 42, chapter 49, verse 3, and so a few places. Chapter 49, verse 3 is the most explicit. God is speaking to the servant who has suffered and is going to be vindicated, and he says, "You are my servant, O Israel." What? Yes, he tells you it's Israel. He tells you that already in chapter 42, if you start there, and that he's talking about Israel is the suffering servant. This seems so strange to people because Israel's a nation. The servant's a person. How do you do that? Right? How do you do that?
How do you do that?
Well, yeah, how do you do that? It is common in the Old Testament to talk about a collective, a nation, as an individual. You get that with humans. You get it with other things. As an example that I've always been fond of is in Daniel chapter 7. This is that passage that Christians ended up using to talk about Jesus as the coming Son of Man. Daniel has this dream, and he sees a beast coming up out of the sea that is like destructive and horrible and awful, that wipes out the earth. And then there's a second beast that comes up out of the sea who's even worse than the first one. He goes through there are 4 of these beasts, and these are awful beings. And then when you can't figure out what's happening, what typically happens in these kinds of cases where you have a vision in the Old Testament, an angel standing by to tell him what's going on. And the angel tells him these beasts each represent a nation. So these beasts actually the first one represented Assyria, the second one represented Babylon, etc. And so a collective is understood as an individual. And that's what happens in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, referring to this Daniel passage. The Revelation does not talk about the Antichrist. This figure is called the beast. And when you read Revelation, it's clear as day. He's talking about the city of Rome. So it is very common throughout the Bible to use an individual to refer to a collective or a collective to refer to an individual. And so when he says that the servant is Israel, he's talking about the collective, but simply using the metaphor of a person to explain someone who has suffered. That someone is actually this nation of Israel. And because they've suffered, they've now paid for their sins. Now God's going to bring salvation to them. So, Isaiah himself tells you this is Israel. And, so I think that's who he's talking about. And in the context, it makes sense. Israel's in Babylonian captivity, Judah's in Babylonian captivity, and God's now going to save them. And so they have suffered, and now they're going to be redeemed.